Chapter 1, Introduction. Hey folks, Chris DeLeon here, and in this audio, we're going to focus on a ridiculously straightforward technique that's going to help make it easier to get yourself to do things. That applies to making small steps of progress on a bigger goal, getting yourself to start or to do a thing you've been putting off, to get across that line of not doing it, or also to continue keeping focus on a task. If you find yourself getting distracted, you find yourself getting kind of steered off course, the technique we're focusing on is going to help address all of those areas. Now, some basic setup stuff. You're listening to the audiobook Self-Command, How to Get Yourself to Do Things, both created and narrated by, like I mentioned, Chris DeLeon. This audiobook is split into 14 chapters, total runtime's about 5 hours. Though as you'll hear, there's a couple places where I'm actually going to encourage you to pause, apply the techniques for a week or two before you continue. It's meant to be interactive and spread out a bit, for the same reason why you wouldn't just slam together all the lectures in a course from a whole semester back to back. It wouldn't stick. There's only one or two of those points, though, and I'll explain it as we reach them. Speaking of which, quick overview of what's ahead. Chapters basically fall into 4 major parts. So there's 14 chapters. You can kind of think of it as 4 different phases. Chapters 2 through 4 will provide a little bit more background on the need for the material and how it came about. 5 through 8 will dive right into the technique that's at the core of this method. Chapters 9 through 12 build on that by focusing on the strategies for how to apply it in different phases. And what I mean by that, when you're starting something new, when you're trying to stick with something long enough to get results from it, recovering from disruptions, or using it in a way that works for you long-term, sustainably. Chapter 13 is kind of in its own category, almost a supplemental part, but it's important in that my focus there is on helping you untie some mental knots which I've found, if left undressed, can needlessly limit the ways in which you'll be able to apply these strategies to make lasting improvements in your life. And that is, by the way, both my purpose and my promise here. This isn't just about being an informational set of ideas to give you something to think about or talk about. My real goal is that through listening to this and applying the material, you can get the real-world equivalent of a stat upgrade to your ability to get yourself to do the things you mean to do. Chapter 14 is a relatively short concluding chapter, basically to remind you that by completing this material doesn't mean you've hit the end of using it, but are instead embarking on an all-new beginning with a new ability that can bring you new opportunities. As another way to frame that, since my background's in game development, for those of you familiar with the Metroidvania genre of games, there's something called ability gating. And if you're not familiar, all that means is that there's areas of the game world that can't be accessed until your character gains the ability to swim, to climb, to turn into mist, to fly. My objective here isn't just to help you do things better that you were going to do anyway. My objective is to help give you abilities that can push down gates that before might have seemed inaccessible or outside of reach. But nor is this technique only for people who feel like they've been having major difficulties. When I was testing this material out with different people, several people who already were very focused still found and reported back to me that using this method helped them identify several cases where they were actually more easily distracted than they thought they were due to jumping between things in a way that this technique helps reduce. And so the approach we'll be talking about here is really something that anybody can benefit from, not just if you feel like you've been having specific problems in this area. The reason why this has become such a problem today is that a generation or two ago, in fact, for most of human history, the problem was being able to find some sort of plan, some sort of path, some sort of material that could work. Anymore, we are drowning in it. There is an essentially infinite amount of content surrounding us that we always have access to, that we can easily get our hands on, that we can easily put in front of ourselves, that instead our barrier becomes not, is it available to us? Can I find it? Can I get at it? In many cases, we've got tons of them bookmarked. We've maybe even paid for some Udemy courses we haven't been through. One of the reasons why this has been kept so focused, as well as why it's audio, is when I was first developing this material, it kept growing in scale. It kept trying to cover all the different possibilities. It kept becoming a tome, literally hundreds of pages of text multiple times. And what I realized is that if someone's difficulty is getting themselves to do something, well, you can't begin with read a few hundred pages of text. So we made this audio so it's easier for you to fit all of it in, whether you're getting ready in mornings, whether you're driving on a commute, while you're exercising, while you're doing something else. Hopefully you can help pipe through this, get through it. Also makes it easier if you want to give it a re-listen. Sometimes things, when we're said out loud, we are zoning out for part of it, we're distracted for part of it. I find when I have audio materials, I'll listen to it often multiple times. That helps catch me at the right time when a certain part relates and connects to where I'm at with something. I want to give specific thanks to some of the members of our online game development club who helped give feedback and piloted this program, tested it out, and their experiences in our club, going through our intro materials, assigning themselves tasks on projects, pitching and leading projects in some cases. But I want to thank Vaughn H, Stebbs, Cornell, Brian N, Claim, Anthony J, Spad13, Mike L, Trent P, Jeremy K, Simon H, McFunky Pants, Osama A, Marcel S, Andy K, Terrence M, Dominic A, Gonzalo D, Pernille K, Michelle O, Iwe C, Jose S, Ryan G, Barish K, Matt S, and Bilal C. All of your feedback during the piloting phase was really instrumental in helping get this material as strong as it is to help as many people as it's going to help. Thank you so much for your input and feedback. I want to thank Spinwires, an incredible band whose music I'm using here with permission. You can find their latest album at spinwires.bandcamp.com. I also want to give a quick thanks and shout out to the Home Team Game Devs, Mentor in Residence, Krister Kaitila, and all of our trainers and my friends and family. Many strategies I'm passing on here began as seeds planted by their advice. We all benefit when more people around us are better able to get themselves to do the things that they mean to do through the exercise of self-command. Chapter 2, on getting yourself to do things. I've always been fascinated by this trope from fiction where sometimes there's characters that can write something down and make what they write down a reality. When I was a little kid, it was sort of an aspect of Neverending Story, which is also what happens in the Myst universe. It's been a part of Once Upon a Time. It's kind of how things worked in Inception. And sometimes it's a special pen or a special language or a special book or a special way of describing. Part of what drew me to game programming in my own path was realizing that here was a way that through specifically writing down clearly enough a description of what I'm trying to make happen, I could write it into existence. I mean, on a computer screen, but objectively enough, I could share it around the world without really much loss in the signal. What I write is what I get. And what this audio is really about is actually kind of a microcosm of that in the real world. It's not quite the same as being able to write that you're going to be able to fly on a dragon or anything like that. But it instead deals with being able to write down something in the present, to control the present by what we write. It's something that allows us to be much more conscious, much more deliberate in what we're doing and how we're going about it. And while perhaps not to the same magical extreme as we see it in fantasy and fiction, we certainly can begin to write our future simply by writing our present, one task and one day at a time. Because as you gain proficiency in this, as you gain momentum in your ability to follow through on your intention, to write something down and get yourself to do it, this sets you up to build a queue, to build out a plan with some trust that you'll actually be able to follow at this time, to even try out some other more complex systems. Not under any expectation that they're all going to work any more than every shoe is going to fit, but at least with a firmer sense that you'll be able to give it a fair shake by following these steps, by using the materials, by making use of the opportunities around you. But just like if you're writing in the language of Denis in the universe of Myst, if you're dreaming in Inception, there's a very specific way we can go about doing it that gets maximum effectiveness out of it. And so what we're going to be exploring here is A, the setup for it, B, some tips about how to do it well, and then C, the mind state to be in that really helps it work, to get yourself to do the things you've been meaning to do. Stoic Epictetus wrote, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." The focus of this entire audio is going to be on how you can better get yourself to do what you have to do. Picture who you will choose to become when you're better able to direct your own action, when you're better able to follow through on your intentions, when you're more consistently going to be able to make more efficient use of whatever limited time, energy you have to work from. Because it's something where even a small gain, even a little more consistent control over your energy and over your use of your time can over time have a huge effect in your life. Can really lead to a big difference down the line because it's got a compounding effect. But our focus here isn't even really going to be on what to do with it. Our focus here is going to be on how to do it. And it's going to be up to you to decide how you want to use it to become a little bit more who you want to become. Let's look at some ways that you're going to be able to write the present into reality. Chapter 5, Staying on Task. Here is the core technique of how to assign yourself something in a way that you can get yourself to do it. And it's going to sound embarrassing. Because part of what happens is that when we sit down meaning to do something, we get kind of caught up in distractions. Maybe sometimes we even forget what we sat down to do. We would remember if someone asked us, but there's kind of a hint of shame in it since, A, we needed the reminder. B, we might be painfully aware of the fact we've strayed from it, or maybe don't have much to show despite having been, in theory, sitting down to do this. And this affects anybody from a school kid trying to do homework to adults who are meaning to work on their writing, who are meaning to work on their podcast, who are meaning to work on their game, and yet the progress isn't happening even if it's why they sat down on their machine. And so what we're going to set up is a reminder of what you're trying to do that you don't have to be prompted for from the outside, that doesn't need someone else managing you. And here's all it is. We get a whiteboard, small, one about the size of a notebook, something easy enough you can bring along in a backpack to a coffee shop, something you can easily place on your desk somewhere in a way that's not in the way, something that doesn't take up a ton of room and clutter. And what we're going to use that whiteboard for is writing down a single task, a bite-sized task of what you're doing for one sitting. For example, a half an hour to maybe 2-3 hours max. We're not going to write the next task on it. We're not going to write out a full to-do list. Think of it almost as a one-item to-do list. It is the item you are doing right now. Now, as simple as it sounds, there are some tricks to getting maximum effectiveness out of doing this. So, for example, the reason why I emphasize that it should be something you're doing in one specific sitting, rather than, for example, someone else might hear, okay, you write what you're trying to do on a whiteboard. They might write like a month goal on their whiteboard and set it on their desk. Well, I'll tell you what happens in that case. You forget about it. You ignore it. It kind of falls into your blind spot. You no longer see that anymore and think about it at all. When it's one sitting, every single time you are touching and interacting with it. Every single time you're erasing it, you're rewriting it, it's getting you to think about, what am I doing with this sitting? What is my intention for what I'm trying to achieve when I'm sitting down to do this? So this also means that you're not setting it up the night before. Some people write the advice about you want to plan the next day, the night before. There's advantages of doing that for a to-do list. There's advantages of doing that for strategic thinking. When it comes to the task you're trying to do, though, I'm not trying to say the night before you should write down what you're going to do in the morning. I'm going to say in the morning what you're trying to do, you write down what you're trying to do. This is also important to not put down two different things, because what it means is that one of those things we're writing down, we're not doing, because we're only doing one thing at a time. And part of how this works is we're trying to train ourselves. So as soon as you finish writing it on the whiteboard, you start doing it. You've probably so often heard that the hard part is starting, getting yourself to start typing a story, getting yourself to reopen the art asset. We're trying to turn this into a trigger for you, and it's going to take a little bit of training to do. But really the goal is, as soon as you write down your task on the whiteboard, that becomes what you're conditioning yourself to mean. This is what I am assigning myself to do with this time. And the moment I have finished writing it down, I'm going to start on the task. If I can even get myself to start a task by my own mental command of what I wrote down on a whiteboard, is it clear what a difference that can make in our ability to direct our time and our attention? Rather than these things where we sit down meaning to do something and then somehow the time disappears, we wind up with hours of screen time inexplicably spent on platforms and social media and other things and news aggregators like Reddit that we didn't mean to do. But we can write something down, and we know as an agreement to ourselves that we are practicing, that we are training ourselves in through repetition, that when we write it down, the moment the marker leaves the whiteboard, the moment the pen leaves a page, if you're doing the written on paper version of this, then you start doing it. And as simple as that sounds, that can already help release you from some of the most common distractions, sidetracking, ways that we fool ourselves into thinking, into feeling internally like we're working on a thing when really we're procrastinating it, we're putting it off. So we're going to write down exactly one thing on that board. It's the thing that we're doing in one sitting. And the moment we finish writing it down, we start doing it. And then you want to sit it open face on your desk facing you. It's right there. It can't be ignored. This is part of why it's so important that it's physical, why it's tangible, why it's not something digital on your screen, why you're not just emailing it to yourself, why you're not typing it in a notepad and minimizing it. Because part of what's great is that this allows it to essentially keep yanking your attention back. You can't hide from it. It's right there. Every time your attention starts to drift, you have this as a filter to look back to and ask yourself, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? And as silly as that sounds, as much as it seems like it shouldn't matter, I find, and the people I've worked with who've tried this have found, it genuinely helps. It creates a clear filter. It answers that question where we kind of forgot what we were trying to do. We started to get off course, and this helps us correct it as near as we can to immediately. Another finding from general self-control research that supports this, there's very much an effect of what is in arm's reach, what is in our nearby attention, exerts an influence on the decisions that we wind up making. Maybe you've had this mistake of where you put cookies on your desk and you wind up eating all the cookies way too fast because they're right there. You are taking that task and you're giving it the immediacy of being on your desk. It's in arm's reach. It's that much more convenient. And what's also great about having it right there is that sometimes it's a step towards a longer term goal. It's part of a bigger picture piece in a longer queue of plans you have for yourself. But it takes that task and it puts it in the immediate. And the immediacy is another important part to keeping ourselves on task. Now, there's another couple notes about what we're writing on the whiteboard. Because again, there are ways to do this that work better, and there are ways to do it that are less effective. This is why there's a lot of experimentation and trial and error and exploration went into this. When you write it down, you want to not just write down a noun, you want to make sure you're writing down what's the action. So if I'm making an art asset, I don't write player sprite. I wrote, I drew the player sprite. And also note, I put it in past tense. I didn't say I'm going to draw. I said I drew the player sprite. And this has an interesting little effect on us. Most of us are honest people. Most of us are uncomfortable with lying. Most of us have a challenge to write down something on a page that's even temporarily not 100% true. It's a fiction. We know it's a fiction. That tension, that little bit of discomfort. You can picture kind of like a cliffhanger in a story. There's need for resolution that has not been satisfied yet. When you put it in past tense, I fixed that bug. A tiny lie that we are attempting to make true before we get back up. And this is again why it's nice to frame it in the scope of one sitting. We don't want an untruth hanging over us for a week. We don't want an untruth hanging over us for a month. There's a little too much fake it to make it going on there for a lot of our comfort, and we just start to disassociate from it. If it is a one sitting fix, a half hour to maybe a few hour situation, you can write down in past tense what's going to be true by the time you get up, and then you don't get up until it's true. And we're going to go back to some additional notes about making maximum effectiveness of what we put on that board. But I want to clarify why it is so simple and so straightforward. I know at first it can feel like, are you serious? What on earth is achieved by writing down a sentence on a whiteboard or on a notepad? Part of why it has to be so simple and straightforward is because this way you can't fail to use it right. It's general enough to apply to a flexible variety of different tasks, different kinds of steps in those tasks, that it doesn't take much, it's not a huge expense, it's not super laborious. Chapter 7. Jumpstart the starter technique. Now here's a big trick to getting into this new behavior. And this is very counterintuitive, but also important. When you first start doing it, it's useful to do the motions before you stretch to apply it to something you really need it for. It just gets you spun up. It gets you through the steps. It gets you familiar with the process. And going through the motions matter in part because I want you to think carefully about this. If the only things you write on the whiteboard are things that you know you were struggling to do, you know the odds were against you, you know it was an uphill battle to get yourself to do, you are dooming yourself to see it as something unrealistic or about what you're putting down as things that you've already shown yourself before just aren't going to happen. You need to condition yourself into the habit, just part of the process. I put down this, I follow the instruction. How hard could it be? I've got the recipe, I just got to do the step. And so you want to begin by basically applying it to something you were already going to do anyway. Obviously, the goal is to move it towards things where you do need it. But we got to get there incrementally. We got to start by writing down, were you going to brush your teeth anyway? Sounds dumb, I know. Write down, I brushed my teeth, past tense, by 10:30 p.m. So we gave it a time bound. One quote-unquote sitting, even if we're standing up at the sink. As soon as you finish writing it, start brushing your teeth. As soon as you finish brushing your teeth, erase it. Same thing if you're making yourself breakfast. A lot of this can feel or sound a little silly at first. What's not silly is being in control of your actions. What's not silly is being able to achieve the kind of results you can get from having better clarity over your ability to translate from thought to an assignment to yourself that you follow through on so that the same day you have performed an action. It is hard to overstate the level of power it gives you in your life when it no longer becomes a question of can I get myself to do something, but allows us to elevate to a strategic level of I can get myself to do basically anything I mean to. Strategically, what should I give myself to do next? Somewhere between writing down what you were going to do anyway, and somewhere between writing that down and doing something that is hard, doing something that you were intimidated by, that involved struggling against your identity, that involved rethinking what you know, that involved looking up answers to questions you did not know how to solve. Somewhere in the middle ground, you can assign yourself something just because you wouldn't have done it anyway. That thing doesn't have to be hard. That thing could be, I got up and turned off the lights, then turned them back on by 5:45. That thing could be, I walked into the other room and back by 7:30. The whole point of them is that they are totally doable, but that you would not have done it had you not written it down. And the way this starts to establish for us a rhythm that when I write something down, I can get myself to do something that I'm capable of, but wouldn't have done otherwise. And if the thought of doing this is a little bit uncomfortable in terms of your bodily momentum doesn't lead you to want to do that sort of thing. You don't see a clear reason. You don't feel a clear reason to do it. Again, think back to the fact that many of the tasks that you consciously recognize you want yourself to do may not necessarily align with what you were on track to have done anyway. That it's because we understand there's a gap, there's a difference between what we consciously want ourselves to be doing and what we were otherwise going to do, that this whole setup is necessary and therefore worth practicing. It's practice at letting our thoughts, our intentions, our words dictate our physical actions in the world around us. So I write down, I went for a short walk and returned by 7 p.m. I finished writing, I walk down the block, I walk back, and I erase it. Specifically because it was a thing I wasn't going to do otherwise. It can be little stuff, it can be minor things, it shouldn't be grand. I'm not saying you need to stretch your boundaries of what you're comfortable with or anything like that. Because as senseless as those tiny examples probably sounded, let me give an example of a way I still use it that actually is really similar to that, but uses it in a very specific way. Let's say I know it's been a rough day. When I sit down on the couch, when I know that I am basically going to go into, I just need a moment. And that's fine. There's no shame in it. There's no guilt in it. But at the same time, my intention, my plan, my conscious want for myself is to get back up from there. This is not the rest of my night. This is a moment of catching my breath and recovering. When I sit down, I will make sure I'll go to my office. I will grab my small whiteboard and marker. I'll bring it with me when I sit down, because that's giving me my foothold to get myself back up. Because otherwise I'm going to sit there and tell myself a few more minutes, and I'm going to lose track of time. But if I sit down, even if I don't sit down and write down, I'm going to take a break for X amount of time because maybe I feel more comfortable idling. Having that nearby, here's the trick and where it becomes simpler. Rather than getting myself off the couch and doing something hard by writing on the board a work task, when I need to get myself off that couch, what I'll actually write on the board is something easier to do. I rinsed my face by 7:30. I got some Ritz crackers out of the pantry by 7. These are incredibly basic, incredibly easy, simple, non-intimidating, low-pressure tactics. But I did the thing where I put it in past tense. I gave it a time. As soon as my marker leaves the board, I stand up and I go do the thing. I come back and I erase it, but I got myself off the couch. I stood up. And it's so much easier to work with that momentum of getting up and moving around to then, heck, I'm already off the couch. I've already kind of snapped myself out of it. Walk back over to my laptop in my office, hunker down with my whiteboard again, and now I've used it as a stepping stone towards figuring out from one of my Trello boards what work task to put on my board next. But I didn't get myself off the couch with a high bar. I gave myself the lowest possible bar that I knew would just get me moving forward, get me moving at all, even if the task itself wasn't important. Is it clear now why something as simple as that example of getting up to the light switch or walking to the other room and back might actually have a little more hidden utility than it seems like? And the same thing can actually work at a bigger scale than just to get ourselves off the couch. It can be quite often easiest if we I like to say, aim closer. When people are trying to shoot down range, one tactic that they use, the target is far away, try to pick a spot closer and aim at that. Somehow that helps. Let's say I need to work on my research paper. Rather than trying to go straight for that, which maybe is kind of a high wall of motivation or required energy to start, instead I might use the whiteboard to get myself to go over to the library, or heck, even to go over to where my desk is. And once I'm in that situation, once I'm in that spot, it becomes that much easier to do. Something as simple as, let's say I'm already at my computer, and I'd like to do some computer art. I'd like to work on some game art. Rather than trying to go straight for, I'm going to create a character asset, or I'm going to implement some existing art in the pipeline. Instead, I might, again, aim closer. What's the actual next step? That if I do it, it's going to put me in that situation. I might put on my whiteboard, I opened Photoshop by 8 p.m. I opened Visual Studio by 9:30. And by having the right program open, it's the digital version of going to the library for my research paper. So this way we can actually do the same sort of thing as we might just to get ourselves off the couch. We can work at a bigger scale by putting ourselves in that situation, just to help ourselves work our way out of that inertia of sitting still and of not doing anything, or at least not in the direction that we want it to go. And this same aim closer technique can also be used to utilize the whiteboard system even for things where you're not going to necessarily have the whiteboard in front of your face the whole time. So, I mean, as simple examples to this are, say, working out in the gym. Do I expect you're going to carry around the whiteboard while you're lifting weights? Obviously not. But here's how you can still use the aim closer technique to jumpstart getting yourself to the gym. I put on my workout clothes and my workout shoes by 7:30 p.m. Now, once I'm in my workout clothes and my workout sneakers, I'm just going to sit around the apartment. And even if I felt like it, okay, well, the next step maybe is I got in the car by 7:45 p.m. I'm sitting in the car with my workout clothes, my workout shoes. Do you think I'm not going to get myself to the gym? The more we can move ourselves that direction with a little bit of this sort of aim closer or other kind of jumpstart techniques, the easier it is for us to get ourselves to the point where we're like, you know what? May as well do it. I'm here and I'm ready to go. Likewise, maybe you don't want the whiteboard in your kitchen while you're cooking, but you want to be cooking more. If I can use the whiteboard to get my cooking books out on the counter, if I can use my whiteboard to gather up the recipes, gather up ingredients, update my grocery list to include the ingredients that I need, I can use it to create the situation in which, at that point, the effort needed is so much lower at the actual time of because I'm in the situation or have everything that I need. And so the most generic way to think about this aim closer technique is if there's something which you don't feel comfortable writing on the whiteboard because you don't feel like you could promise it to yourself that it's something you can take action on in the next sitting, can you identify then a different action to address that point? So for example, I'd like to cook a certain meal. Well, I can't write that down, I don't have the ingredients. Therefore, instead, I should aim my action at getting those ingredients. But again, maybe it's that I'm not in the middle of the grocery store yet, in which case, again, it might instead be add the ingredients to my grocery list. Now, perhaps it's that I don't remember what exactly ingredients I would need to prepare that recipe. Okay, then I think I put on the whiteboard, I've narrowed it down to I need to find the website that had that recipe. And this helps put me down that path. It's kind of a reverse planning. And this can happen on an extraordinarily different scale. If we set some sort of much larger goal, I would like to organize a professional conference. Okay, well, maybe I don't feel comfortable writing that yet. Let's think about why. There's a lot of connections I would need to pull that off that I don't currently have. All right, then, what would my action be I could write down to make some of those connections? Okay, I might think about I need to get myself to some relevant conferences in industry to introduce myself to those kind of people. But maybe I don't quite know what those conferences are. I don't quite know the cost. I don't know the times of the year. And once again, we kind of worked our way back to the action we can literally take in this same sitting, which is do the research online to find the relevant conferences, to build myself maybe a sheet of information to make that decision about where is it worth going, where can I get the most bang for my buck, where can I kind of afford to do it in budget. And speaking of in budget, this might also be the case where there's various things which maybe are either expensive or out of reach in the foreseeable future, or in any case, certainly in the near term, but that we can, in the same kind of way of aiming closer by working our way backwards of why can't I write that down yet, instead attack questions like, if I would need to raise money to do it, and I don't yet have the position I would need to raise money, What are some things I could do to increase the odds of that being an option afforded to me? And that might be some sort of pursuit of certification, qualification, other networking connections, other demonstrations of our own work, other ways of building up or proof of concept that would make that easier. And it helps move us towards a situation in which we could write that with reasonable confidence. That's a thing we are prepared to attack directly rather than it seeming out of reach to be able to put it there right now. I realize raising money for a business, starting professional conferences, maybe those are kind of a little too big. So let's pull back to something a little more human scale. Reconnect with someone you haven't spoken to in a long time. Let's make that the possible example. Find someone, figure out somebody. Maybe you went to school with them. Maybe you were in your hometown together. Maybe you're related, but not the kind of family that stays in touch all the time. Give yourself a task to reach out to them. Let's go back to this point. What you put on the board is the action you take, not the outcome anybody else does. You're not in control of if they reply. You're not in control if you have a whole conversation with them. For all you know, they won't even respond. For all you know, you can't reach them. For all you know, you can't find them. So we're going to put there is we're going to say, I reached out to such and such by 7 p.m. If you couldn't even figure out how to contact them because they deleted their Facebook account, their old email address seems invalid, well, we tried. We gave it a shot. Make action happen in the world around you from having written on the whiteboard you would not have done otherwise. That can help us build up momentum in that bridge from only doing things that we were going to do anyway, to doing something we would not have done anyway, to increasingly building on that through establishing trust and habit with ourselves, that when the marker comes up, I start doing what I wrote down. When I finish doing what I wrote down, the action part that I am in control of, I erased it. Here's another thought about what you do and don't put on the board. If there's something you're trying to get yourself to do, or you think you've been trying to get yourself to do, I mean, telling yourself you're trying to get yourself to do it, but you can't even muster the level of active decision-making and starter action to write it to yourself when you're alone. At that point, it may be better to admit you don't actually want to do it. Or maybe you're just not convinced it's going to be worth your while to do. Either of those may be true. Either of those may be okay. That's not as condemning as it might sound. That's not judgmental. For years, I owned a mandolin. I learned like a few chords, felt overwhelmed, never really got further on it. And at some point, I had to quit stressing myself saying, I really am someday going to learn to play that mandolin. And I just came to terms with, it's a decoration in my office. And then I just sold it. I had to let it go. I didn't keep beating myself up, wondering why I wasn't a mandolin player. It's okay. And this is, again, one of the nice parts. If I don't feel comfortable even writing it on a whiteboard to myself when I'm alone, maybe I don't actually mean to do it. That maybe is okay. Maybe it's healthy for me to make that realization that I got to find something I actually care about, because how much do you have to really care about something to write it down on something right next to you or in a notepad that's in your pocket? If you aren't convinced it's worth your while to do, that's another factor. And this is part of this detail where we're afraid it's not going to pay off. And part of the difficult reality is when we're new to anything that's like a lifelong enrichment skill. If we're new to a sport, if we're new to playing an instrument, if we're new to painting, it'll take a very long time and a lot of experience to financially, if ever, pay off. Most of us will never get paid to play basketball. Most of us will never get paid to play music or make art or make video games. It can still be worthwhile. It can still be valid. If we don't focus on what we're going to get out of it in the near term, we won't stick with it long enough to ever even have a shot at getting out of it the things that can only be gotten out of it in the long term. It might become a matter of reframing and saying, okay, well, what do I actually get out of doing it in the nearer term? Because there's still reasons why it's worthwhile to play a sport, play an instrument, produce art, make games. It can be about, I'll find it creatively fulfilling. It can be about, I'm going to learn new skills. And by focusing on these things we get out of it, it can become a matter where we can better justify it to ourselves. And overcome the reason why we really put it off is because we were so fixated on what we weren't realistically going to get out in the short term that we were overlooking what we will get out of it in the short term. Think about why most people who learn martial arts are learning martial arts. Are they doing it to become stunt actors? Are they doing it to win street brawls? For most people, they're doing it for discipline. They're doing it for focus. They're doing it for physical health. And those are things that are guaranteed. It's increasing the self-confidence no matter what else happens in a way that's a worthwhile activity in itself. There might be, in the case of something where you're having a hard time convincing yourself that it's actually worth your while to do, some other kind of benefit that if you look at it from the right lens, it's worth giving yourself the effort and the chance and the opportunity to assign it to yourself by writing it down while you do it. A lot of those kind of things and why we do them can really be kind of drawn by analogy to why people do high school and collegiate extracurricular activities. Why someone would play a club sport even if they don't really see themselves going pro necessarily, which again, maybe someday they will. For many people they won't. It can still be worthwhile. But this is actually a really valuable point of learning that happened for me. When I was younger and applying for schools, I applied to Harvard. I didn't get into Harvard. But when we visited the campus and we did a tour, our tour guides mentioned that Harvard has a ton of athletics. People think of it as a very academic institution, but it actually has a ton of sports teams. And so one of the parents asked, how does the sports activity affect your grades? Because after all, again, grades are on their mind, or they wouldn't be shopping around to consider going to Harvard. Self-Doubt by Chris DeLeon. Introduction. First, I just want to do a real quick high-level explanation of what this material exists for, why I'm creating it, where it fits in. And basically, it developed from a few points I made in my productivity audiobook, Self-Command, where self-command is about helping yourself stay on track for a task. But there's a few points in there that I realized kept coming up when I talked to some of my training clients, the people I help with game development, about basically why they wouldn't begin a task, why they wouldn't even trust themselves to start down it. And there's a lot of different ways of thinking that these questions that pop up in our head, these doubts that occur, that are perfectly natural, that happen to all kinds of people, regardless of age and cultural background. In fact, regardless of training, even if you have the confidence of a related degree or work experience, still when we're independent, when we're trying to explore our own territory, break new ground and grow in new ways, these kind of questions come up and challenge us. Really, this is problems far more general than game development, which is where most of my practical hands-on training support kind of experience is, and really just more broadly about creative endeavors of any kind. If you want to produce your podcast, if you want to write a story, if you want to do something else, and maybe make music of no relation to games, these same questions and doubts arise. The whole goal here too is to keep it short enough that it's not going to expand into a massive tome. Because I know often one of the challenges is if it's too much material, we might not start. Think about what are the reasons why we don't take on a task. Why wouldn't I give it to myself on my whiteboard using the self-command method? Part of it is that there's just too much there, right? We look at the mountain, we say, I can never climb that. We look at the marathon length, we say, that's too far to run. And so we're going to be framing these in a way we can knock them out pretty quick. But before we do, I want to special thank some of the early test and feedback review from Patrick McEwen, H, Abhishek Kirthi, Gabriel Cornish, Barish Kokolu, Andy King, Luis Montagna, Claim, Jeremiah Franchik, Rodrigo Bonzer Lopez, Simon Hafiz, Ashley M., and Fahad Muntaz, as well as several other members and colleagues who took the time to listen to early drafts and offer feedback, but chose to remain anonymous. The material ahead will be focusing on these questions that bubble up inside us, these self-doubts. And what I really wanted to do here is a simple, just sort of a rapid-fire combination of question and then how to counter that question. The question that arises internally that can block us from making progress, that can stop us from assigning ourselves a task, from trusting ourselves to even try starting it, and then how to take it apart. What thought to counter it with that buries it so you can move past it confidently. Section 1. Starting. Am I losing all the progress that I've made in my current field by switching to something else? And this can be a really scary one, especially if you've been at what you're doing for a while now and made some progress and seen some growth and seen some achievement and been rewarded. It can be very tough to feel like you're starting at the base of a new hill. Everywhere you go, everything you ever do, you're taking with you all of your accumulated experience, all your other concepts and knowledge and tools and network, and that other perspective, that blending of tool sets, those additional connections of viewpoints, that really is what will set you apart from other people who only started and stayed in one field. Certainly in game development, we see a lot of the cool advances happen when a programmer takes on an artist mindset, or when an artist goes about it using programming tools. When there's someone who makes music using their strengths as a networker, or someone who approaches marketing using their experience in music. When you go from one field to another, you're still you. You still have your unique history. That fingerprint is going to always be with you. And even if you don't take the same tools, the same exact techniques, even just your concepts, your ways of thinking, the examples that come to your mind and the people that you know, those will set you apart and make you unique in that space. In game development teams, we see them as technical artists, as technical game designers, as people who are at a Venn diagram where they may not be as deep in software engineering or in design, but that combination of spaces makes them great bridging communicators, gives them a different way to interact with the medium, and in all kinds of other fields you'll see the same connection between people who may come from one kind of background, but that's what makes them a unique writer. That's what makes them a unique voice on YouTube, different from somebody else who didn't share that unique background. What if there's more I can learn about this first? There's always more you can learn about it. There will always be more material. There's essentially infinite material to learn from because not only is there more already in existence, probably online, probably free or affordable, than you could ever get through all of, but more of it's being produced faster than you could ever consume it. That's just the pace of technology and information these days. And so because of that, you can't keep putting off doing things until you've learned every single thing ever written or said about it. Lots of folks use it as a form of procrastination. Once I finish this book, once I finish this video, once I finish this tutorial series, then I'll get my hands dirty. And it does take a little bit of a foundation to get started, but a lot of this foundation a lot of people think they need to give themselves in order to start getting real hands-on experience doing it. And your ability to absorb and act on the benefit of what materials are out there that are written and spoken vastly improve when you have context to have better questions, to have seen how the things you're finding fix actual issues you've run up against from having first tried doing things in the way that came naturally to you, or that were the best you could do from the things you had read and seen so far. Until that point, so much of the information is sliding right off of you. It's only by diving in that you become part of that community of people who are doers in that field instead of on the outside looking in from a distance, an observer or a commentator on what's happening. So much of what we think of as learning only really sticks if we have put things into practice, if we have tried it, if we have done it. And until we've put it into practice, it's going in one ear and out the other. We need to be doing it and applying it, and then from that, situating knowledge in and around that, applying what we learn to fill in gaps that we're running into, to fix problems that we surface, to take us to the next level. But to tell where we're at, we have to be doing it. So sooner rather than later, you want to be doing the things, making the stuff, applying what you can do so far, get it out of your system the way it makes sense to you. And by doing so, it's going to fit in and click much tighter and better and last and stick. When you learn why there's other ways to do stuff, you'll be able to contextualize that and situate it in, aha, that fixed the problem that happened when I approached it in another way. The sooner you can actually start to do it, to put it into practice, to trying it, the sooner the real learning will begin. And the more value you'll get out of all the time you put into learning it. What if I can't decide what to do first or how to do this first part right? For many kinds of work, certainly it's the thing we do in game development, it's the thing I do in writing, it's the thing I do in business. It's often easier to start by making a mess, getting it out of you, just putting it down in some form, and then once it's outside of you, cleaning it up. One way that I like to visualize this is if you picture trimming a hedge, so carving it into a shape, you have to let it overgrow first. And in the same way, often it helps to start off with having too much down, to then be able to refine back from looking at it overall and figuring out what, after I remove the weakest parts, is going to have the shape that I want it to have. Put it through process. Put it through testing. Give yourself some rest and then come back with a fresh set of eyes. Put down the ideas. Just get them out of you in whatever order they come out. Do the editing pass separate from the writing pass. So when we talk about how to make a schedule, we put down all the tasks we're going to do in no particular order, and then we go back and we switch and arrange them in a way that makes increasingly more sense. When I'm not sure what points to make in what order in a talk, I first just practice speaking improvisationally about it a few times. Then I figure out which of those points are recurring in a pattern, and then is there a reason why some of those points might come before others? Sometimes the order matters, sometimes it doesn't. But it's easier to tell once it's outside of you. We get held up when we don't want to let ourselves speak until it's final draft coming out of us without the process. But we'll never get that. That's not how professional writers or speakers do it either. Just get something out of you to be doing it, and once it's out of you, iteratively clean up the part where your efforts make the most impact on it. There's also just a huge strategic point important for giant projects that we take on as game developers. There's so many pieces that we could get lost into cleaning up and polishing and making better and better and better. But what works well is to get everything that we possibly can working together in first pass first, and then to figure out where is our attention and energy best spent. Where do we get the most bang for our buck? Where are the problems most noticeable? Which problems are easiest to fix? So rather than getting stuck on trying to do it perfectly, let yourself do it imperfectly. And then after the fact, iteratively make it more and more perfect. What if I run into a question or a complication and I don't know how to proceed? That is what you want to have happen, right? Picture that you're digging on the beach and you hit metal. That's the treasure chest. Next step is to figure out what you got to do to open it. Do you need different tools? Do you need some help from other people? But that's your sign that you found what you're looking for. You want to go until you get stuck. When it comes to people scheduling calls with me for support and training, it helps if they've gotten to a point where they're blocked. They don't know how to proceed. They're in a bind. They're feeling stuck. That's when it's helpful to reach out for help. And not until that point. Until that point, they can and should explore independently. And that's exactly what you do up until you bump the wall. And then once you hit that barrier, that's where now you're going to get some real value out of digging online for examples, of reaching out for help, of teaming up with others, of starting to identify, here is the gap in my understanding. Finding that is the thing that you need to address, that's the sign of progress, that you've made enough motion to identify that that's where your learning, growth, and new opportunity is going to happen. But to do that, you have to make enough progress to bump into the obstacles, to discover where they're at. In classical Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius in Meditations, as you heard from Self-Calm, if you picked up that audio or read that free ebook that I've released, there's a notion popularized as the obstacle is the way. That if there's a large fire, then the things that try to block it just become fuel for its way forward. They guide it by what tries to block it. And this is exactly what we're talking about here, of those things that you run into and you feel stuck on. That's great. That is exactly what you were digging for. You found it. That's your feedback. You're taking the right direction. Now, you might have to adapt your approach a bit, which got you down to that treasure chest. May not be the same tool you used to open it, but you're on to the next stage. You should hope to hit questions and complications that you don't know how to proceed. That should be the goal in doing a lot of things to advance your learning. What if this project is not a great idea or the right idea? If we picture across the arc of your lifetime, the best ideas and timing that you possibly might have, all planets aligning on exactly the right time to do exactly a certain thing, well, you don't want to pollute that one with your beginner errors. You don't want that to be the one where you're first learning about every single piece of the process. Sometimes when I meet with people about starting their game development journey, they have these ideas for big, ambitious projects that they want to take on. And what we first do is we'll make a stepping stone plan of some smaller projects that build them up to the confidence and preparedness and background so that by the time you're taking on the bigger, ambitious project, no piece of that is their first time tackling that kind of piece of a project. They've already done one or two UIs, one or two types of relevant AI, one or two types of sprite art or background art or 3D modeling so that they can better conceive of it in a way that's going to maximize what they can do with their tools, with their experience, with their skills. You don't want to start on your best ideas. And if you could somehow tell, and maybe it's hard to even tell, but if you feel like something's your best idea, it may be best to not start with it, but to build up to it, to take it apart, to build a plan around what are the stepping stones to get you there so you can tackle it with more confidence. And what that partly does is helps build you a bridge to the fact that, again, it might be too daunting, too large to start because you don't trust yourself with it. And not to be too harsh, but maybe there's a level which if you're totally inexperienced, you might be right. You may not be ready to climb that mountain yet. You may not be ready to run the marathon yet. And speaking of marathon, think about how what impresses someone about a runner of a marathon isn't that they went into it unprepared, that they did something completely bananas and decided overnight to go do it. It's because they decided to do the training to prepare themselves so that doing it was the next natural step in their progression. What if I'm not sure how to start or don't have a good idea to start with? In a lot of crafts, and I say this because I've mostly seen it in game development, but out of every piece of that, from modeling, from sounds, to programming, to design, and so on, it can often help to start by cloning something else that exists. And I'm going to put a huge asterisk there. That the expectation in doing this isn't actually that you're going to produce an exact clone. It's that in the process of having some momentum, of having clear direction from the start, positions you to start putting your own twist on it, to start doing it your own way, to start finding where and how you personalize it in a way that you're situating real decisions about a real thing that's being built and going into motion, so that by the time you produce what comes out, it's very different than what you started with. Not just pretty open that Minecraft began as an Infiniminer clone, but it took a very different direction and scaled to a much different audience. And the same is true for a lot of people starting game development. If you just start with a generic project, a generic space shooter, generic racing game, if you're working on a song, pick a genre and make a generic piece. If you're working on a recipe, right? Pick something that's an established way to make something, and then from that, begin to explore ways to deviate, to personalize, put a twist on it, to make it your own. But it gives you enough to start getting some movement again, and that movement's what allows you to start having a meaningful decision in how and where you're steering it differently, in a way that's harder to tell in advance what you're going to like because you can't test it piece by piece as you go. Section 2. Timing. Did I get into this too late because everybody else seems to have already had a head start? You're never too late. Looking back on it, you're always going to wish you had started earlier, which means right now is the time you're having this thought. That's when future you is going to wish you had actually done it. You don't want to look back on the fact that you thought about, should I have started already, and feel bad because you didn't, and then still not start, or another year passes and you still haven't done it. The other thing is that in a lot of cases, the people who you think have a head start on you because they've been doing it longer, maybe haven't been going in the right direction. So it doesn't matter if they've been going longer if they've been going backwards. Things are changing constantly. So it was the right direction 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Today is no longer the right direction. And what happens is people who were doing the right thing at the time, who are making progress, in hindsight, are going to have to do a lot of relearning, unlearning, changing their approach, changing their tools, changing their pipelines, adapting their network in new directions. And because of that, you actually have about as good a footing as they do. Now, they might still use that experience to get their foot in the door somewhere. They're certainly going to get some confidence boost out of it. But part of what's wild about how technology is always changing, and this is true for a lot of other creative fields too, where the trends are constantly moving, is that somebody else who may seem to have a head start, their head start is an obsolete direction, and you're much closer than you think to catching up to them. It may only be reading a few books or making a few projects before you might be surprised you're about as adept as anybody else is at certain tool pipelines, at certain topics, and at the very least able to get out there and be doing it with everybody else. And most importantly, it is that you're out there doing it. You're not just reading about it. You're not just thinking about it. It really comes from once you're doing it, everybody else around you will respect you as a peer who's doing it. Regardless of if they had a head start, regardless of if they've been doing it longer, regardless of doing it in a different way than you. But it begins by being someone who's doing it. And I'll even throw out there as another example of where, for me as a game development trainer, we've often seen happen. And sometimes I'll give talks about topics or about training for techniques and tools and so on. And one of my barriers I have to contend with is that someone says, okay, well, you learned this stuff a long time ago. You've been doing this stuff for so long. How can I put myself in their shoes as a new person? My answer, of course, is that I'm helping a lot of people who are like them. I help a lot of people who are at where they're at. And so that's a little different lens. But there's often the case that if somebody's giving a talk who's been doing this for 5 or 10 years, and they see someone else on YouTube who's starting it right now, they're just learning it as they create YouTube channels, talking about and giving tutorials and, hey, I just learned this yesterday. Here's how it worked for me. That recency, that freshness is actually really appealing to a lot of people about, okay, well, they're closer to my level. I can relate better to what they're doing. So you might surprise yourself too. You might think, oh, I'd have to be a master in order to teach. There's classes I taught in grad school where I was literally just 2 weeks ahead of the students I was teaching. That's all it takes to teach sometimes. And the same thing's true for no matter what your experience level. There are people who are behind you in it as long as you've been doing it, but that begins when you start to do it. And to do that, you have to not panic yourself over, am I too late to start? Did too many others have a head start? Now is the best time to do it so you don't look back later and think about, I wish I'd started last time I thought about, is it too late for me to do it? What if I'm too old or too young to be doing this? The wild thing about this objection is that in the 25 years I've been doing what I do, I've seen literally the same people go from saying that they're too young one day to complaining that they're too old the next. The same person who thinks they're too young will say that they're too old. There's literally no perfect or only age to do it at. And if that age switchover sounds hard to picture because you don't personally know someone who set an arbitrary division in which they switched from saying they're too young to being too old, consider the more common case of people in your peer group who perhaps said they didn't have time to do a certain thing because they were in college. And now when asked about the same subject or when they talk about it, will say that they can't because they're no longer a student anymore. Now, obviously because of what I do, game development and its related skills are often where I see that happening for people. But the same thing absolutely holds true as well for people who talk about weekend sports activities, exercise routines, training for marathons, or picking up other hobbies. And let me tie this for a moment to a weird experience I had back around 2010 when I had the bizarre privilege and surprise of being part of the first Forbes 30 Under 30 list. It was literally the first list, and so to whatever you might have heard about people trying to get onto it and that making an important thing to them, I wasn't even aware of it until they approached me. So for what it's worth, I literally made zero effort to get on there. Want to lay that up front. Another note about it, it's actually 30 people per category, of which, depending on the year, there were between 12 and 15 categories. So really we're looking at like the Forbes 360 people per year, every single year for 10 years and running. So there's literally thousands of these people. So I'd go to these conventions a few times where once a year they'd get people together from this list, just curious to see who else is on this, how'd they get on here, what the heck's going on. Hoping maybe I could make some network connection there that either might help me in my line of work or perhaps even help me introduce them to somebody else and make things better for everybody. Now, there are sometimes some celebrities who are on that Forbes list, and let me be clear, none of those people show up. I wasn't hanging out with LeBron James or Justin Bieber. But what was strikingly obvious was that a lot of the people who were there in the different categories were doing things that really, if somebody was in their 40s or 50s and accomplished that, might not be all that groundbreaking, might not be that big of a deal. It's just a thing that people in their adult lives, in the normal path of their lives, own and sell some real estate commercially. Might start a business. Might launch some VR titles. And the same was true for what was weird about me was the things I was doing when I was 27 years old, but really if I had been 37, no one would have thought twice about it. And that under 30 distinction, again, it's not about, oh, you have until then to do it or doesn't count. What that really is it's a weight class. If you took that cap off saying it's only people under 30 being compared against each other, most of them would be immediately rendered irrelevant, not noteworthy or newsworthy at all for what they'd done, again, compared to plenty of other thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of just adults in the normal course of their lives. It's like how someone might be good for a child pianist, but they still are easily not comparable to an adult pianist. It's getting first prize in Little League Baseball. It's a reflection of some combination of luck and privilege and other factors for sure. But it's really just people who had a little bit of a head start compared to a whole bunch of other people who, again, on the normal course of their lives, do many things that are frankly bigger news. And so it's really the wrong way to look at it to say that, well, across 30, is it too late for me to do certain things? No. In fact, now it's actually the normal stage of life when many more people do the same things that get a lot of people on those under 30 lists. It's not an important indicator of what you're capable of. It's just an arbitrary cutoff point of it would be strange if certain things happened by this arbitrary milestone. This age dimension is also interacted for me in a kind of an odd way where I'm now well into my 30s. I've been identified at conferences, people thinking I was 26 years old, 19 years old, just because I have kind of a baby face. I just look very young. This also resulted in some YouTube comments on my viral videos where people would say, oh man, wait until this person gets older. And I had to be in the comments saying like, sorry, this is probably peak performance for me at this particular skill. But I remember thinking when I was first starting a business that it was a problem that I looked so young because I couldn't get other people to take me seriously as a teacher. Because I couldn't take other business people to take me seriously as a peer. Enough time has passed, or certainly after the pandemic's tolls and stresses on me, I'm visibly a little bit older than I used to be. Or as at least one friend puts it, now I look like I'm 26, trying to look older at least. But then I have the opposite problem of people who won't listen to me on YouTube because they think, what am I going to learn from that old guy? And there's some different pros or cons or disadvantages or advantages in either difference. There's an old John Wooden quote about this, that to do not let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. Look for the version of it that you can do from your situation, instead of stressing about how the opportunities you have to do it might look different if you're 15 years old versus if you're 45 years old. But though there may be a change in the approach, the style, the format, the priorities, and how you go about it, the pace at which you go about it, no matter what you want to do, there's almost always a version of it you can adapt to the stage of life that you're in, the age that you're at, the skill level and situation you have, and taking that one step forward at a time is the only way anybody builds anything up. What if I don't have enough time in the plan or the schedule? And the point you might hear recurring from me in Self-Command and other productivity material I've worked on is that a lot of different tasks that we do are kind of squishy. There's the fast version, there's the slow version, there's the ultra slow version where we go out of our way to improve and iterate and get feedback and test and so on. And so what we have to scale the level at which we decide we get the version out that meets the amount of time we want to give it. If we want the version of a song we can give ourselves in a week, in 2 weeks, in 1 month, in half a year, or 2 years, it's going to be a different approach, but it's an active choice. At which point we decide how to close up the loose ends, polish it up, package it for delivery, title it, choose who to distribute it to and how. Focus on fitting the phases by piece into the interval that you gave yourself. Because the only alternative is it not happening at all. Even teams with enormous budgets, with enormous experience to draw from and a huge team, they still have limitations. They still wish they had a bigger team. They still wish they had a bigger budget. They still wish they had more years on their project. If you can't learn to work with the amount of time that you give yourself, then there's no amount of time you can give yourself that'll fix that.